smoking in the mall.
At Memorial Hilton, I can do whatever the I want, bitch!
Scene. The bratty, loud, and iconic aesthetic that ruled MySpace profiles, Warped Tour parking lots, and mall food courts across the globe. It began in the early 2000s, launched to popularity in the mid-2000s, and declined in the early 2010s, and it is the collective source of millennials' cringe and heartwarming nostalgia. Whether you lived through it, or you've seen it on TikTok, or you're just discovering it now, I hope this video can help you try to dissect it right down to its core. As in all my videos, we're going to look at how this aesthetic came to be, its key clothes, accessories, hair and beauty trends, its other key visual identifiers, and its eventual decline in popularity. Let's just get straight into it, there is so much to cover. Background. In the early 2000s, something was happening in the hardcore metal scene. Among the sea of black band tees and mosh pits, a new kind of fan started to emerge. Girls in hyper-stylized outfits. They were called scene queens, a derogatory label for girls who apparently weren't really there for the music, but just to put on a fashion show. But this wasn't the beginning of flamboyant fashion in hardcore music. It was more like a resurgence. Let's just rewind. Since the dawn of metal, there's always been this kind of gatekeeping energy around looking authentic. In the 70s and 80s, that meant looking tough, gritty, masculine, anything else and you were just a poser. But then glam metal blew that rulebook to shreds. In the early 80s, bands like Motley Crue, Warrant, Twisted Sister, Poison, and Bon Jovi strutted onto the scene. They were not only fusing hard metal riffs with pop ballads, a big no-no, but also doing it with big hair, tight pants, and full faces of makeup. The metalhead purists were furious. They were messing with a sound, and more importantly a look, that you just don't mess with. But hair metal said, actually no, you can be metal and campy. Fast forward a couple of decades and the spirit of glam metal was bubbling back up. By the late 90s, most hardcore bands and metal bands were still clinging to the masculine uniform, baggy jeans, skate shoes, band tees, but cracks were beginning to form. In San Diego's hardcore punk scene, Justin Pearson of The Locusts started blowing up in avant-garde, almost theatrical looks. Around the same time, sasscore bands, like the Blood Brothers, were serving screamo with queer-coded lyrics and campy performances and styles. And then came something called fashioncore. Born on the West Coast, this was a movement within the metalcore genre, which was basically a fusion genre that mixed punk and metal. And fashioncore really pushed style to the forefront of metal bands. 18 Visions really started it by using eyeliner and nail polish and flat iron straight hair or super stylized hair and gothic or kind of horror themed outfits, and then bands like Atreyu, Bleeding Through, and Avenged Sevenfold followed. It was polished, it was femme, it was everything traditional metalheads hated. But it caught on, and scene kids are largely seen as fashioncore's evolution. Because from there, the floodgates opened for fusion genres and their often flamboyant fashion. The 2000s were basically chaos in alternative music fashion. Metal in particular went through a lot of fusion genres. Metalcore went mainstream, and bands like Killswitch Engage, As I Lay Dying, and Bullet for My Valentine brought in clean vocals and catchy melodies to the genre. Deathcore also arrived, which blended death metal with metalcore, think Job for a Cowboy and early Bring Me the Horizon. Electronic core threw synths into the mix, which really shook old school metalheads to the core, think Attack Attack and Asking Alexandria. And then there was crunkcore, that wild blend of crunk hip hop, screamo and metalcore, which brought us 303, Broken Side and Hollywood Undead. Crunkcore was basically engineered to be hated. And to be honest, it pretty much was. Emo and punk wasn't safe either. Emo, once a raw and indie sound, started sounding very poppy in the 2000s and just exploded in popularity. This did have a massive impact on scene, as many scene kids identified with the emo subculture as well. Meanwhile, punk got an electronic makeover with acts like Cobra Starship and The Millionaires, or a sugary, sweet makeover with bands like Metro Station and Forever the Sickest Kids, whose sound was so poppy it earned them the nickname Disney Punk. And while they were mostly just doing a more sugary version of what Blink-182 and Sum 41 had done in the pop-punk boom of the early 2000s, I can't tell you how looked down upon this was by old school punks. But all of these music genres were a part of the scene subculture. Scene was all about mixing what wasn't supposed to mix, genres and styles. A hyper-stylized aesthetic wasn't really allowed in these kind of metal alternative fashion scenes, but that's what made scene rebellious. Not against society, but against genre and fashion gatekeeping. And if glam metal 20 years prior cracked the door open, scene kids kicked it off the hinges, because they basically had a very powerful engine behind them that helped create and spread their aesthetic: MySpace. MySpace wasn't just a social network, it was the first real aesthetic engine. Users could customize everything: backgrounds, playlists, profile pics, top friends, colors, GIFs, animations. Your profile wasn't just a profile, it was an aesthetic statement. And for scene culture, that visual freedom was fuel. At the same time, MySpace music made it easy for users to discover new bands, especially the ones that mainstream outlets ignored. So aesthetics were really formed alongside growing cult followings for undercover bands, and this made it easy for alternative girlies to become icons. Enter the scene queens, the clear rulers of MySpace. These were people like Audrey Kitching, Hannah Beth, Jack Van Eyck, Amor Hilton, Raquel Reed, Zoe Suicide, Kiki Cannibal, Amber Beale, and yes, even Jeffree Star.
Dear Diary, I wish there was more than 2 genders, because I'm getting really bored.
They dated band guys, hung with them at the Warped Tour, and also sold their own merch and did meet and greets. They curated followers, then known as MySpace friends, in the thousands, which was a lot back then. And they were kind of influencers before influencer was even a word. They created looks and lifestyles that were so desirable they were imitated by millions of scene kids all over the world. Because yes, thanks mostly to MySpace, the scene aesthetic spread like wildfire. Kids from suburban US towns to cities across the world could all access the same fashion, music, and digital community. Similar subcultures popped up globally: Shamata in China, Floggers in Argentina, Pokemon in Chile. And they all shared that same chaotic, maximalist, genre-blending energy. So much so that by the late 2000s, everyone knew what a scene kid looked like. Ridiculous to some, aspirational to others, but instantly recognizable and to this day, unforgettable. So let's break down the aesthetic in a lot of detail. Clothes. So you guys know the drill by now. I always like to contextualize fashion influences of an aesthetic before breaking down specific pieces. It just gives us more of a deeper understanding, I think. But the thing is, there are so many with scene. You guys. But you know, I'm gonna break it all down for you. Hair metal and punk. So we've already kind of talked about 80s hair metal. Punk is something I kind of touched more on in the emo video. It had a stronger influence on emo than scene, but it's still worth mentioning. In a nutshell, punk fashion in the 70s and 80s was rebellious, androgynous, and super DIY. It was born from working class youth who were pushing back against society with clothing that shocked the mainstream. And my god, has their legacy stuck around. Punk has basically shaped alternative fashion for the next 50 years. One major underrated influence of punk on scene was its DIY spirit. As many punks simply couldn't afford or didn't want to buy new items, so much of their look was handmade and done themselves. Scene kids kind of followed in their footsteps, which gave the aesthetic a kind of scrappy, handmade edge that made it feel uniquely theirs. We'll see some examples of this as we go along. Rave and cybergoth. While raves started in the 80s, they really took off in the 90s, and basically they centered around electronic music, euphoria. In its beginnings, its fashion was all about oversized and functional clothes, but it did often incorporate neon and chaotic, childlike costume pieces. One rave subgroup was cybergoths. They emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s out of the graver scene, or gothic ravers, who began raving due to interest in industrial music. But cybergoths created their own otherworldly look by mixing dark industrial and goth style with bright neon rave fashion. It spread online in the early 2000s, and while their look made them look too spooky for ravers and too neon for goths, this mishmash of influences, neon colours, and just a hint of rebellious alternative subculture made them perfect for scene. Garou and kawaii. Garou style popped up in the late 90s. While the exact look varied significantly depending on the specific Garou subculture, it was largely a rejection of traditional Japanese beauty standards by incorporating gaudy, Western-inspired fashion and makeup. Alongside their partying and clubbing lifestyles, they were also seen as a rebellion to traditional Japanese female roles. Kawaii, on the other hand, is a Japanese cultural phenomenon all about cuteness. Born from 70s youth culture, manga, anime, and icons like Hello Kitty, Kawaii celebrates innocence, pastel colours, and playful accessories. Scene took big notes from decora fashion that layers childlike accessories, clashing patterns, and colourful chaos. Hot topic, or really emo. Scene kids loved emo. There was just a ton of crossover, especially thanks to, you guessed it, MySpace. Scene queen Hannah-Beth even said in an interview with Nylon recently that it was the emo subculture on MySpace that pulled her into the scene world. And no conversation about emo and scene fashion is complete without mentioning their holy land, Hot Topic. I've already covered the history of Hot Topic in my emo video, but here's a quick rundown. Basically, Hot Topic started in 1989, and by the early 2000s it was the place for old teens to get band merch, dark fashion. It wasn't just a store, it was a community. Bands did signings, played live music, and hung out with fans there. Since both emo and scene fashion was sold there, it's no wonder people got them mixed up. And yeah, visually, they were very similar. Scene kids often started out in emo and sometimes called themselves emo. These aesthetics were definitely fluid, but there were key differences. Emo fashion was darker, moodier, and leaned more punk. That makes sense because emo music came out of the hardcore punk scene in the 80s. Scene fashion, which was not tied to any one music genre but to many, was brighter, louder, more eclectic. Its connections to electronic music made it way more ravey, and its love for Japanese aesthetics made it more childlike. Scene kids wore things that emos never would. Too cheerful, too neon. Hip-hop. The influence of hip-hop on scene is surely in part due to the popularity of crunkcore. But also, more broadly, hip-hop just dominated youth culture in the 2000s. In the early to mid-2000s, it was the blingy and over-the-top hip-hop fashion that influenced dominant aesthetics like McBling. This trickled down to the scene aesthetic. So let's just recap. Scene fashion, as far as I can see, took inspiration from hair metal, punk, Hot Topic and emo, rave, cybergoth, Japanese street fashion, and hip-hop. That's wild. This list probably isn't even complete. But here's the thing. Scene kids came of age at a very specific moment in time, when the internet gave them access to an endless feed of global fashion, music, and style. So, like the fusion music genres they were listening to, they took all of these style elements, mashed it together, and made something totally new. That's the legacy? I think that's the magic. So now, let's break down specific items. Tops. No scene outfit was complete without a t-shirt that was loud, bright, and usually covered in like a quirky, nostalgic print, or a cartoon character or childlike motif. Band tees were also big too, just like an emo, but there was a difference. Emos usually wore dark, moody t-shirts, while scene kid band t-shirts were kind of more neon. This was partly because a lot of metal and metalcore bands at the time were releasing merch with cartoon monsters and Dayglow designs. I'm sure old school metalheads were not thrilled about this. Band tees had always been dark and serious, and scene kids, I guess, kind of turned that tradition on its head. Then we had hoodies, again something shared with emos, but scene hoodies were almost always colourful, often featuring the same cartoony, chaotic prints on their t-shirts. The hoodie was a staple in broader 2000s mainstream fashion, just a classic normcore item, but it has also been a big part of hip-hop fashion since the 70s, so it does make a lot of sense for scene. Bottoms. The skinny jean was a cornerstone of the 2000s scene aesthetic. creating an androgynous style across all genders. They had long been tied to alternative music scenes, especially 70s punk and 80s metal, and the 2000s silhouette took influence from that big top, slim bottom silhouette from glam metal in the 80s. Think oversized hoodies or t-shirts on top, skin-tight denim below, sometimes in bright colours. And then the tutu, an essential piece for scene queens. Worn by ballerinas since the 1800s, tutus became shorter, puffier, and more symbolic of delicate, idealised femininity over time. Made of tulle, a fabric long linked with bridal wear and formality, tutus represent beauty, innocence, and delicateness. I really can't think of another skirt that is more iconically feminine in the West as the tutu. Dance scholars have noted there's this romanticised vision of a tutu-clad ballerina, which remains a universal sign of perfected femininity, which is probably exactly why scene girls subverted it. Think Madonna in the 80s, pairing tulle skirts with lingerie. Think Yohji Yamamoto's Red Bustle by Nick Knight in 1986. Think Rei Kawakubo's 2005 biker and ballerina runway show for Comme des Garçons, with pink tutus clashing against tough leather jackets. Scene girls were doing something similar, mixing metal and punk elements with hyper-feminine tutus to subvert expectations. I mean, look, it might not have been that deep, but I do think having all these elements mixed in here does mean they created something kind of bratty. Accessories. Jewellery. One thing to know about scene jewellery, you had to wear a lot of it. Arguably the most essential accessory to a scene queen look are copious amounts of plastic beads. Scene queens were obsessed with brightly coloured beads, usually candy and or fuse beads. They often handmade these pieces, an example of their punk DIY influence. They were drawing strong visual parallels with both children's fashion in Decora, who often used dollar store jewellery to finish their look, but also definitely rave culture. Plastic jewellery is iconic in rave culture. Here, candy beads are worn to trade through a ritual meaning peace, love, unity, and respect. Rubber bracelets were also big in scene. Like emos, scene kids collected band merch in bracelet form that were usually covered in song lyrics, logos, or random slogans. These bands knew what they were doing. Rubber wristbands were a massive 2000s trend, especially after Lance Armstrong's Live Strong bands dropped in 2004. Meanwhile, those scene kids' thin gel bracelets go back way earlier. Madonna and Cyndi Lauper helped push these jelly bracelets into fashion in the 80s. Though they were first seen in Latina girl gangs in 70s Los Angeles. In the 2000s, these bracelets were everywhere in schools, with playground rules around what to do if someone broke yours. I won't go into this, it's insanely inappropriate, and when I look back now, it's no wonder they got banned from so many schools. There are two more iconic scene necklaces, the diamond and the brass knuckle. The diamond felt like a parody of 2000s hip-hop bling, and scene queen Kiki Cannibal famously sold overpriced versions in her Kiki Couture line. Brass knuckles, originally a weapon, later worn in punk and metal, were reimagined in girly, plastic, colourful form, again kind of maybe subverting a masculine item. Pearl necklaces were also worn, but costumey and plastic, similar to Decora dollar store jewellery. And if we want to get deep about it, and I know you do, by the way, pearls are a historic symbol of wealth and aristocracy, which I talked about more in detail in my 2000s preppy video. Making them look so trashy and cheap and seen was kind of punk. Then you had edgier, emo, punk influences, studded cuffs, dog tags, razor necklaces, terry cloth wristbands, and piercings like snake bites, nose rings, and gorges. All of these had roots in earlier punk and metal scenes who were either subverting expectations by creating fashion from commonplace objects, or trying to shock the mainstream with more provocative and edgy looks. Belts. Scene belts were more of a statement than they were functional. The most iconic were studded belts. Black studded belts were a staple punk item, worn slung over skinny jeans, and were later picked up by emo kids in the 2000s. But scene kids were different to emo kids, and they also loved pastels or checkered versions or bright neon versions. White belts were another classic item. These trace back to 90s sasscore and fashioncore, a moment in alt music where bands dressed just as loud as they sounded. White belts became so tied to that look that some people even called sasscore the white belt scene. And then there were the blingy buckle belts, big, shiny and bold. They pulled inspiration from Western wear, but also from hip-hop fashion in the 2000s, where massive, blinged-out belt buckles were status symbols and a big influence on the McBling aesthetic. Shoes. Converse and Vans were staples for both emos and scene kids combined. They've been a massive part of alternative music fashion for decades, and particularly for scene and emo kids thanks to their involvement with the Warped Tour. But where emos mostly wore black versions, scene kids wore neon and mix and match pairs. They were often scribbled on, which if you ask me is reminiscent of punk DIY styles. Knee-high Converses also became really popular, a re-release from the 80s, and these could be considered kind of similar to tall combat boots which were popular in historic punk and metal fashion. Rave fluffies were absolutely essential to a scene queen. Originating from podium dancers in Ibiza in the 90s, they were also worn by cybergoths and garu girls. They're a classic example of scene's eclectic nature. And lastly, you had the Osiris sneakers, specifically the NYC 83 model. Originally designed by skater Dave Mayhew, who was also behind the infamous Osiris D3, the NYC 83 exploded in popularity for its chunky silhouette and outrageous colours. It took a lot of inspiration from 80s hip-hop high-top sneakers, which at the time were also adopted by hair metal musicians. In the 2000s, while skaters were hating it, scene kids were loving it. It was the perfect mix of metal, hip-hop, and excessive, impractical style. Glasses. Scene kids loved shutter shades, a type of sunglasses that were first seen in the 50s, made a comeback in the 80s, and were revived for mainstream fashion in the mid to late 2000s after Kanye West in his 2007 Stronger music video. Shutter shades also had a big moment in crunkcore thanks to Soulja Boy. So the outrageousness of them and the fact that they were linked to hip-hop, crunkcore and partying culture and were always stocked at Hot Topic made them perfect for scene. Scene queens also wore many sunglasses that were popular in broader 2000s fashion. Oversized sunglasses, for example, which pulled from McBling in 2000s celebrity it girl fashion, and later on in the mid to late 2000s, Wayfarers and horn-rimmed glasses became popular, borrowed from the indie hipster scene. Even if you didn't need glasses, you wore the frames.
Alright, and I stole these glasses too. I know I'm so brutal. I got them from my local movie theater.
Hosiery. One of the most iconic scene accessories was a tall striped sock or striped legging. Their origins go back to Victorian Gothic styles, and more goths and cybergoths in the 90s. Early 2000s Japanese youth also wore this item to create punk looks, including in decora styles. Then there were also black or neon fishnet tights, which pulled from cybergoth and DIY punk roots. Scarves. The kufiya scarf was another crossover with emo and broader 2000s style. These scarves are a symbol of the Palestine resistance and Middle Eastern and North African culture, but were turned into an indie sleaze icon in the 2000s, largely thanks to Balenciaga's 2007 winter collection that brought them to the mainstream. Small bandana scarves were also big and were also worn tied around wrists or thighs too. This came mostly from hip-hop culture, originally seen as gang symbolism. Other accessories. The striped arm warmer. So iconic for scene. Borrowed from goth and more goth fashion, these were a crossover accessory with emos for sure, almost always sold out at Hot Topic. Other styles that crossed over with emo and were largely rooted in 70s punk fashion were skinny ties and crossover bags covered in badges. Punk used these to mess with corporate dress codes. And lastly, there were snapback caps, a smaller part of scene fashion for sure, but definitely not random. Originally made for baseball in the 50s, they gained major traction in the 80s, 90s hip-hop scene. Think Michael Jordan's Gatorade cap in '89, Will Smith in Fresh Prince, and NWA's iconic look. Their strong ties to hip-hop just show how influenced scene kids were by that fashion. Hair and beauty. I don't know if anything is more iconic in scene than their hairstyles. Makeup styles were important too, don't get me wrong. But hair? It's what they were most known for, and most ridiculed for. But that iconic, jagged, choppy, asymmetrical cut with long side bangs and bright streaks of colour is just one style of the aesthetic. If you track how scene hair changes over time, it's actually quite varied. At the beginning of scene in the mid-2000s, hair was flatter and streakier, often with extreme side bangs, and taking a lot of influence from emo side bangs, who themselves were largely inspired by late 90s side-swept fringes on alternative bands. Around 2007, you saw this extreme growth in hair volume, usually involving teased hair at the crown that was worn smooth, with extreme side bangs that covered most of your face and were held down with a bobby pin, bow, or hair clip. There were also similarities here with Garou fashion, where hair is bleached, big, and often wigged. With scene fully in the mainstream by 2008, scene kids began marking their style with stiff peacock feathers at the crown of the head, paired with long straight extensions, or tendrils. This bold look was extremely similar to the 80s glam metal silhouettes. This year you also saw a lot of the gunshot wound hairstyle, which was spiked in the back, flat bangs in the front, and had strong ties to gothic and punk spiked hair. 2009 was the peak of volume, and it came in a heart shape at the crown of the head. Patterns and symbols in hair was also massive. The most famous was raccoon hair, horizontal, high contrast stripes, sometimes bleached, sometimes neon. Other shapes and symbols were sometimes hand-dyed by extremely talented scene queens, or just added using extensions from Hot Topic. For male scene kids, asymmetrical long flat hair with long side bangs was iconic. It was apparently first created by 18 Vision's bassist Javier Van Huss, a hairstylist as well, who was inspired after seeing the haircut on a poster of the band Orgy. After the 2010s, and as the subculture began to decline, scene hair volume significantly decreased. As we moved into the Tumblr era, styles became more focused on intense side bangs and full heads of brightly coloured hair. Manic Panic Dye was the go-to. It's possible that rave culture, especially cybergoth, inspired this bright, exaggerated, often synthetic hair look, but scene queens often dyed their hair themselves, which was also similar to punks in the 70s, who often DIY'd bright hair colours into their looks. Hair accessories were just as important as styles throughout. Giant hair bows, sometimes comically oversized, were iconic throughout the aesthetic, pulling directly from kawaii fashion. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, thin elastic headbands worn over the hair became trendy, influenced by broader indie sleaze fashion and possibly 80s style headbands as well. And of course, no scene queen look was complete without a sparkly costume tiara, an it-girl staple from the 2000s McBling era. In scene, it was more subversive, like the tutu. It clashed hyperfemininity with punk and goth styles. Just like hair, makeup was dramatic, gaudy, outrageous. Scene queens were some of the OG beauty influencers and often used YouTube tutorials to help the aesthetic spread. Like emo, there was tons of black eyeliner and eyeshadow, but scene often wore it in a round shape around the eyes, which, combined with the hair, earned them the nickname raccoons. Guyliner was also a big thing, often leading to mockery for male scene kids. And black nail polish was an important beauty trend as well. All of these trends have roots in early punk and goth makeup styles. The dark vibe on women and the fact that males also wore a lot of makeup challenged mainstream assumptions about traditional gender. Scene kids and emo kids were arguably doing a similar thing, but scene makeup, while yes, again very similar to emo, was different in that it also embraced all these bright colours and quirky symbols. It often used bright eyeshadows and patterns and symbols on the eyes that matched their hair. And neon nails. So many neon nails. Using the most artistic 2000s beauty products of the day, typically from MAC, it was common to see full-on dramatic and costume-like makeup that blended influences from drag, garou, and goth. It all added to the cartoonish, larger-than-life vibe that defined the aesthetic. Other visual cues. Symbols, motifs, and art. Scene fashion was defined by chaotic, quirky motifs. Think diamonds, dinosaurs, bats, crowns, cassettes, skulls, stuffed toys. Rubber ducks were a thing for a while. These were printed across shirts, pants, accessories, and everything in between. A common thread amongst all of these symbols was that scene had this love for childlike and infantile motifs, which I think comes straight from decora and kawaii influences. Patterns like checkers, stripes, leopard print, and zebra were also really popular. Combined, they made a visual riot. The colour palette was a bit easier to track. It was basically just black mixed with anything bright or neon, which was similar to cybergoth. There was something very 80s about all this colour and chaotic patterning, which would make sense. It was the 2000s and fashion tends to repeat itself every 20 to 30 years, and 80s styles in general were having a massive comeback across broader late 2000s trends in general. Scene art, which was also considered emo art, was another key motif. I did talk about this a bit more in the emo video, but basically it's jagged, pencil-like line work with stick-thin bodies, large heads, and exaggerated anime-style eyes was just iconic. It seemed to be influenced by artists like Tim Burton and characters like Elle from Death Note. Brands. Scene kids embraced characters that balanced cuteness with darkness. Children's franchises like My Little Pony and Pokemon were hugely popular, embraced for their whimsy and nostalgia, but no character was more important than Hello Kitty. First created by Yuko Shimizu in 1974, Hello Kitty grew with the rise of kawaii culture and exploded in the West in the 90s and 2000s, due largely to increased trade between Japan and Western countries, and a growing interest in Japanese media during this time. Think Pokemon, Sailor Moon, and so on. During this period, Hello Kitty products became insanely profitable and covered just about anything, seriously, from toys, school supplies and stickers, to jet planes and theme parks. She also had many key moments in fashion, including being essential to the iconic bold and campy brand Heatherette in the early 2000s, as well as being featured on Torino Tarantino jewelry, which became a very important piece of jewelry for scene girls. Since her popularity grew, Hello Kitty was especially embraced by alternative subcultures. Not just scene kids, but emos, goths, punks, and so on. There was something subversive about it. In the 90s feminist punk riot girl movement, for example, Hello Kitty was adopted as a mascot to critique outdated forms of femininity and to make the point that it's okay to be angry at the patriarchy and still like girly things. Look, I don't know if it was that deep with scene girls, but by mixing it with punk and metal clothing items, it did have that similar subversive quality. The mixing of dark themes and girliness carried over into scene's love of kawaii noir, or cute with a dark twist. Gloomy Bear, a pink bear who mauls humans, was a perfect example, completely adored by scene queens. And their love for Japanese culture continued with Domo, the quirky mascot of Japan's NHK broadcaster. American characters joined the party too. Invader Zim, especially the character Gur, was just adored by scene kids. Designed by Johnny the Homicidal Maniac creator Jonan Vasquez, the show's jagged, exaggerated aesthetic and the dark comedy style just aligned perfectly with the aesthetic. Other beloved brands included Skulanimals, a brand featuring adorable dead animals with visible skeletons. It launched at Hot Topic in 2006, was promoted by scene queen icons, and became so popular it went on to sponsor the Warped Tour and clothe many scene and alternative bands. There was also Cupcake Cult, which combined kawaii motifs with punk goth elements. Baby Cakes, which was founded by MySpace celebrity Paul Griffiths and blew up with its bright, cute t-shirts. So Happy, known for promoting positivity in brightly coloured toy-like mascots and hoodies. Glamour Kills, best known for their flying pig tee and being closely linked to alternative musicians. New Breed Girl, who were popular for their kawaii adjacent scene looks. Bleeding Star, an icon across scene and emo. And Akumu Inc. and Iron Fist, who were also shared with emo fashion. Iron Fist in particular blew up after Jared Way from My Chemical Romance wore one of their skeleton tops. Technology. Technology played a massive role in the 2000s scene aesthetic. Obviously, the amateurish and rough visuals of early 2000s social media sites like LiveJournal, Bebo, and definitely Stick'em are essential, but none of these sites are as iconically seen as MySpace. Scene kids chose cute goth usernames and decorated their pages with sparkly GIFs, pixel art, and photos with friends. Their glittery neon profile layouts were usually sourced from sites like Pimp My Profile, and they usually filled their bios with signature phrases that also played into the aesthetic. And MySpace proof videos uploaded to YouTube were essential for a scene queen with many imitators across the platform. Blingy was the site for decorating MySpace selfies with glitter, hearts, skulls, and sparkly text. The more chaotic, the better. Selfies uploaded to these websites taken on digital cameras or early 2000s flip phones are also big visual cues, especially if the quality is kind of bad and you're doing one of the following: leaning forward, angled from above, raw claw hands, which came from Scene's love of dinosaurs, the mustache finger pose, a broader late 2000s, early 2010s hipster trend as well, holding signs or hand-drawn text on paper, or writing something on your hand and showing it, or making heart shapes with fingers. iPods with the classic white headphones were also a popular scene accessory, especially the iPod Nano, which launched in the mid-2000s and saw scene kids through a full decade. 2000s mobile phones are also an important side accessory for a scene kid. Probably the most iconic in the aesthetic was the T-Mobile Sidekick, which was a 2000s icon, a prime example of high-tech fashion. Paparazzi photos and commercials that featured 2000s it girls with their blinged sidekicks led to an obsession with them by youth, with Jennifer Aniston referring to them as a purse rather than a phone. Scene queens, in all their bedazzling, loved them, and often decorated them with many large and impractical and cute key charms. Food. I think this is the first aesthetic I've covered on this channel where food is just as iconic as some of the looks. Scene kids incorporated candy and sweet food that is often associated with children, and in some ways, femininity. These could be anything that fits the description, but particularly featured things like lollipops and cupcakes. But Monster Energy was the scene item.
Monster Energy drink, because I'm emo.
Its bold cans matched the scene colour palette. They were marketed to young people in the hardcore music scene, so much so that they were associated by Christians with the devil.
If God can use people in product, so can Satan.
And the brand heavily sponsored the Warped Tour, often there handing out free drinks and band merchandise. All of these elements made the drink perfect for the subculture. Scene kids even embraced their punk DIY roots and created necklaces out of the can lids. The decline. By 2014, the scene aesthetic had largely gone out of style. MySpace was long gone, Facebook and Tumblr had taken over, and while some scene girls were trying to keep it going on Tumblr, cue early pictures of Halsey, it just wasn't the same. The MySpace chaos, the DIY edits, the unhinged energy, Tumblr couldn't compete. Meanwhile, Facebook was minimalist, plain, and allowed for much less personalization of your profile, so it wasn't really the environment for scene to flourish. What's more, a lot of original scene kids got older, became hipsters or DJs, or tried to wipe all traces of their scene era from the internet. And the next wave of scene ditched the neon and teased hair, going for more indie grunge aesthetics instead. But part of the reason it faded maybe wasn't just trend fatigue. The early 2000s internet was pretty wild, like completely unregulated. It felt exciting and rebellious, but also kind of dangerous. Two websites, Sticky Drama and Is Anyone Up, were particularly infamous in scene. Sticky Drama was basically built on bullying and slut-shaming teenage scene queens, and its sister site, Nudes, yeah, it was exactly what it sounds like. All run by a grown man in his 30s, keep in mind. Then you had Is Anyone Up, which was basically a revenge porn website. They posted stolen nudes of scene musicians and fans, many of them underage. I personally don't think it's a coincidence that the aesthetic began to decline around the same time the guy who ran Is Anyone Up went to jail. Many scene kids noticed that around this time the subculture got too toxic and people wanted out. And those websites really were just the tip of the iceberg. Scene had a lot of issues. Glorifying self-harm and eating disorders was pretty common. If you weren't depressed, you'd get called a normie. Some crunkcore bands were just plain gross. Misogynistic lyrics, slut-shaming, sexualizing everything while knowing their fan base was mostly teenage girls. And yeah, a lot of them ended up facing SA accusations later too. Add in the fact that many of these artists were using the N-word or appropriating hip-hop while rarely featuring people of colour wasn't great. But despite all of that, the scene aesthetic was just too much of a force and it left its mark for the rest of the decade. It paved the way for emo rap and e-girl and e-boy aesthetics in the later 2010s. And then it came back. Starting in 2019, Gen Z revived the aesthetic with movements like 29 Scene and the Roaring 20s. New websites like Space Hey popped up, which literally recreated MySpace for a new generation. Many TikTok scene queens began building platforms and are still growing and growing. Gen Z, who were mostly kids when scene was big, seemed to be finding comfort and self-expression in the chaotic and loud style of scene culture. But if you ask me, Gen Z scene is a lot more polished and refined, which I think is reflective of social media being a lot more slick than it was in the 2000s, and a lot more focused on brand deals and curating insane amounts of followers. Don't get me wrong, that stuff was in the 2000s too, but on a far less scale, and with much less quality graphics. I mean, scene queens were the blueprint for building a following purely online, without corporate backing or expensive branding. Back then, they weren't pushing much more than an aesthetic, and that type of influence now seems so inoffensive. Not to mention how much they elevated representation of femininity in alternative music scenes. So I really don't blame Gen Z for loving scene. It's genuinely one of the most unique aesthetics I've ever researched. I mean, the amount of influences alone is staggering. It blew my mind. For all the reasons I've talked about, it's one of the hardest aesthetics to look away from and definitely one of the funnest to make a video about. So what do you think about the scene aesthetic? Were you there? Are you a 2020s revival kid? Drop a comment below, tell me your scene name, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.